Morning, Miss B.
Hey, Miss B.
Sit down. All right, before we get started.
Miss B, I played Pokemon with my brother this weekend.
Still play Pokemon? That's weird.
I watched a movie with the coolest explosions.
Not into that. Why are you out of your seat? And why is your shirt untucked? Why are all of your shirts untucked? Give me that. Sit down.
Miss B, why don't we just...
No! My rules are my rules, and you listen because I said so. Why won't they just listen?
Have you ever felt like Miss B in the classroom? Well, you're not alone. Some teachers rely on a reactive, more punitive approach to classroom management, which can damage the classroom climate and create an environment that is not conducive to learning. It has also been found that teachers across all grade levels have reported needing more behavioral management training and ongoing support in classroom management practices. There is a clear need to create classroom management plans that are both effective and create positive classroom cultures. And as first and second year ACE teachers, this is a particularly relevant issue for us.
Discipline that's punitive or reactive leads to poor student-teacher relationships and also reduces the amount of instructional time available. It also fails to correct disruptive behaviors from students in the long term. Research suggests that there is an association between student noncompliance and punitive behavior management.
Now, the alternative to this is the proactive classroom management. This is a preventative approach to management that focuses on creating a unified classroom system to boost academic engagement.
Our goal for today is to scrap strictness, and hopefully by the end, we'll show you how to manage misbehavior before it even happens. So our guiding question is whether we can have an effective classroom management style without relying on those reactive and punitive punishments. And our hypothesis is that we can in fact do this by focusing on forming and maintaining positive student-teacher relationships. So our first recommendation is focused on the first few moments in the classroom and by beginning each day or each period with a positive student-teacher interaction. So this practice is what's called positive greetings at the door, and it's a routine or a procedure in place to ensure that this happens by beginning each day with a positive interaction, such as a handshake, a quick compliment, a question, anything to elicit a positive interaction with a student as they enter the classroom. So it's a very simple, very effective way to build relationships and create a welcoming environment. Research shows that it also has an effect on students' time on task. By making them more engaged, it reduces disruptive behavior and it builds positive relationships. So let's take a look at one study in depth that shows very strong evidence for this practice. So researchers looked at these three questions: whether positive greetings at the door can increase academically engaged time, decrease disruptive behavior, and whether teachers viewed this as a viable strategy to implement in their classrooms. And they hypothesized that it would in fact increase engagement, decrease disruptive behavior, and that teachers would perceive it to be something that's acceptable for them. So this study, they looked at 10 teachers in middle school classrooms in a large diverse school, and they were randomly assigned to either this PGD intervention or a control group. And researchers measured academically engaged time and disruptive behavior in a baseline in the fall and a follow-up in the winter. So with this intervention, teachers were trained on how to deliver those specific positive interactions, but also pre-corrective statements as students enter the classroom to facilitate successful transitions, and also to students who had struggled with behavior the previous day. They were also trained on positive reinforcement of on time and other positive behaviors. So the results, as we can see in this graph, they compared a pre-intervention with a post-intervention, and we can look at these two different groups with our dependent variable of percent of time in each class period where students were academically engaged. And with our solid black line is that PGD, the intervention group, with the dotted line being the control group. And what we see here is a significant increase in engagement time in the intervention group by actually almost 21%. And then similarly, they looked pre and post intervention for time of each class period percent that was disruptive behavior. Again, the intervention group compared to the control group, we see here a significant decrease in the intervention group in percent of time in each class period of disruptive behavior when compared to that control group. So researchers were able to conclude that this training in PGD was able to decrease disruptive behavior and increase student engagement. And that 20% increase in academically engaged time would correspond to a whole additional hour if you're assuming a 5-hour instructional day. There were limitations, however, as it was self-reported the fidelity by teachers of the implementation, a small sample size, and researchers really did not look at the mediators or moderators of this effect. So to apply this in your classroom, it's very simple basic steps we can follow. By standing just inside or outside the door, we want to greet each student by name with a short positive interaction like those examples listed. This is a great opportunity for student choice. By hanging these posters, you can have students choose what greeting they would like as they enter the classroom, giving them some autonomy and ownership over this procedure. And then finally, you want to focus on directing them to that first activity. This is where those second, third, and fourth components of the training come into play. So we want to make sure we are delivering pre-corrective expectations for what they're supposed to do, specific praise for students who are exhibiting positive behaviors, and pre-correction for specific students who have struggled with behavior in the past. So some potential barriers, first would be time. Many teachers probably don't think they have the time to implement this, but if you schedule it and allow time at the beginning of the year, that initial investment will be more than made up for in the time savings from academically engaged time. Additionally, it may be hectic some days and you may not remember to do this, but you can set a poster, create a poster, or set a timer on your phone to remember to step outside into the hallway to greet your students as they come on in. And then finally, with so many behavioral challenges, it might be difficult for teachers to stay positive, but we must allow time for these these proactive classroom management strategies to work. And we must focus on the positive behaviors of our students so we can maintain these positive dispositions as we welcome our students into the classroom.
Our next recommendation is to get to personally know your students. Research suggests that getting to know your students can minimize management issues in the classroom, limit the need to implement punitive behavior management plans, and lead to an increase in academic achievement scores. Based on personal experience, I've also found that getting to know your students increases a student's sense of belonging in the classroom. So if this is something teachers should be doing, getting to know their students, how should one do it? A study in 2016 suggests that finding similarities between teachers and students could be beneficial in this process. In the study, 315 freshman students and 25 teachers participated in a survey about similarity between the two populations. For instance, students were asked, how similar is your personality compared to your teachers? And teachers were asked similar questions in this vein. Half the students were assigned to the treatment group, in which they received feedback on what the similarities they had with their teacher were, and half the students did not receive feedback. The teachers, on the other hand, received results with half of their students and did not receive results with the other half. So they would find out what were the similarities with half and did not get any information with the other half. In the study, similarity perceptions were measured, where the perception of teachers and students' similarities between each other were measured, as well as the perception of the teacher-student relationships, if they were strong or not, as well as students' grades at mid and end of quarter periods. Let's take a look at the results. 3 categories were measured here in this graph, and this is all based on student data. It's measuring how the students perceive their similarity with their teachers, how students perceive their teacher-student relationship, as well as what the grades of the students are at the end of the quarter. Blue is where the teachers did not receive feedback, what the similarities were between teachers and students, and red is where there were results for the teachers. Notice that we see an increase in all 3 sections here between the control and treatment. That teacher similarity is increasing, teacher-student relationship is increasing, and student grades is increasing from control to treatment. This white Asian category, this green white bar, we'll talk about a little bit in the limitations, but the study found that there was not an impact of the intervention of taking the similarity inventories with white and Asian students. So these results, what does this mean? What is our conclusion? It shows that similarity inventories increase student perception and that of the similarity of teacher-student relationships and grades, and that this can be a beneficial tool for teachers finding similarities with their students. Limitations, this study was only conducted at 1 school in the US, so it's a very small sample size. And the other limitation is there's a subjective evaluation that took place within this study. The white Asian category we saw on the graph, how there were no significant results based on the implementation of the intervention, is based on an evaluation of the principals saying that the Asian and white students at the school are well served while all other students are underserved. So with this information in mind, what is a teacher to do in the classroom? A teacher should find similarities and differences between him or herself and his or her students.
This can be done by doing a survey similar to what was done in the study, or simply by just generating a list on a survey asking what are students' interests and talents and hobbies and what they like to do for fun. Another way this can be done, finding these similarities and differences, is having conversations with students, which leads to the next point, that teachers can find times to interact with students one-on-one, whether that be at lunch, recess, or before and after school. Finding these meeting times gives an opportunity for conversation to happen and these similarities and differences to be discovered to increase those teacher-student relationships and get to know those students better. Some barriers to implementation. Teachers have a lot of things to do, and a common complaint could be that teachers don't have the time to get to know everyone. It's important for teachers to recognize that relationship building does take time, and that teachers can set achievable small little goals each week about what they want to do to take steps forward in getting to know their students better. Another barrier could be that some teachers have rocky relationships with current students they have. And suggestion here could be start by looking at what are some of those things that make the relationship difficult? What are some of those differences? That could be a helpful standing point for a teacher to look to see, okay, what does this student like to do that I don't like to do? And how can I use that information to better get to know?
Our third recommendation is to maintain a high praise to reprimand ratio in the classroom. What this means is that we want more praise statements made to the class than reprimands to the class or behavior corrections. Increasing this ratio is a really easy and simple strategy to improve behavior and maintain those positive relationships with our students. The study that we're looking at is focused on middle school teachers' praise to reprimand ratios and how that affects students' classroom behavior. We're looking at three main research questions, studying the relationship between that praise to reprimand ratio and class-wide on-task behavior, disruption, and grade outcomes for students at risk of emotional or behavior disorder. Those are our target students that we'll be talking about. And we'll finally be studying whether or not there's an optimal praise to reprimand ratio for improving middle school students' classroom behavior. So we were looking at, in this study, 5 Title I middle schools, much like many of the schools that we're working at with ACE. It looked across various subjects, 28 gen ed teachers, and 75 students that were marked as at risk for that emotional or behavioral disorder. The researchers collected observational data on both class-wide and target student on-task versus disruptive behavior, and looked at teacher praise to reprimands given to the class or to an individual. And the way that this procedure was set up is half of the teachers received an intervention where they were taught how to implement this praise to reprimand ratio in their classroom, whereas the other half were just going about business as usual. We see that with these larger dots, that was the group that was receiving the intervention versus these smaller dots on our graph were our comparison. So right away, the praise to reprimand ratio from this intervention is much higher than those that did not receive the intervention. And our class-wide on-task behavior is shown on the y-axis. We see that positive linear correlation. So as praise to reprimand ratio is increasing, so is on-task behavior for the class as a whole. I then overlaid the target student on-task behavior graph with this graph, and we see that there's a really similar correlation between those two. So for both the whole class and those target students with a higher praise to reprimand ratio, we're seeing a lot more on-task behavior overall. These two graphs show target student disruptions and target student grades for different praise to reprimand ratios. For this first graph, looking at the disruptions, we see a negative correlation. So as praise to reprimand ratio is increasing, there are fewer disruptions from target students. The opposite is true for grades. We see a positive correlation as praise to reprimand ratio is increasing, so are those student grades, and both of those findings were significant. An additional proposed mechanism could be that this intervention training serves as our independent variable. So whether or not teachers received that intervention training is the independent variable, and then the increased on-task behavior, decreased disruptive behavior, and improved grades are dependent variables. And that relationship would be mediated by a high praise to reprimand ratio. The conclusion from this study is that there is a linear relationship between praise to reprimand ratio and all three of those dependent variables studied. So higher praise to reprimand ratio means that there's an increase in on-task behavior. a decrease in disruptive behavior for target students, and improved grades for target students. There was found to be no optimal threshold or ratio. Since we saw that linear relationship for all of those, it's essentially showing us that more praise and less reprimand is going to continue to give positive outcomes. Some limitations of the study are that it's one of the few studies that's focused on middle school for praise to reprimand ratio. So we need additional studies to make sure that this is a replicable study and replicable findings. We also didn't look into the effects of praise to reprimand ratios for specific students, but rather those target students as a whole. It's a really small sample size of only 5 schools, and there was disproportionate risk identification between racial demographics, specifically for Black students. Looking specifically at how to use praise in your classroom, there are 5 key components that are really important to remember. So contingency is the first, linking praise explicitly to classroom and student behaviors that you're seeing. Immediacy, meaning that you are praising immediately after these behaviors are occurring. Proximity, meaning your nearness to the student. Consistency, so you're applying these behavioral supports steadily and predictably. And specificity, so you're including this informative feedback about behaviors and being very specific about what you're seeing and what you are liking. Increasing rates of teacher praise can seem like a difficult thing to do, but there are 3 main ways that were found to help. So performance feedback means that someone's coming into your classroom and giving you feedback about your delivery of praise statements. Video feedback is similar, but you're self-reflecting on this. So you'll record yourself teaching and you'll self-evaluate your own instruction. Self-monitoring, you can use a tally mark or a counting tool to record the number of times that you're delivering praise during an instructional session. All 3 of these ways are just there to help you recognize how much or how little you are praising your students during your lessons. Some barriers to implementation or perceived difficulties would be that it's really hard to stay positive when students continue to misbehave. However, by praising positive behaviors instead of focusing on negative behaviors, your students will feel like your classroom environment is more positive and they'll receive attention for positive behaviors instead of negative behaviors. And you'll also not feel so burnt out by the negative misbehaviors that are going on. Similarly, sometimes it seems like students will think that you don't care about misbehavior if you're not reprimanding them. However, there are better ways to address misbehavior and to focus on positive expectations and redirects rather than reprimanding in front of the entire class.
Our 4th recommendation focused on maintaining relationships in the classroom with routine meetings focused on reflective listening. The study we're looking at here involves the establish, maintain, restore intervention method, which looks at trying to maintain positive relationships with students, a 3-step intervention process laid out here, and look to see whether that improved teacher-student relationship as well as classroom behavior. It looked at 10 4th and 5th grade classrooms in the Pacific Northwest, with half of those classrooms receiving that EMR intervention training. The data measured was teacher-student relationship, self-reported data here from a survey, as well as disruptive behavior and academic engaged time recorded through observations. This intervention led to a 9% increase in those relationship scores, a 75% decrease in disruptive behavior, as well as a 33% increase in engaged time, right? So the teacher behavior affected student classroom behavior with those changes because of the changes in student-teacher relationship quality, right? So in conclusion, this intervention led to significant changes in the relationships, as well as there being a small association between those positive relationships and classroom behavior. Now, it was a small sample size, and they were intentionally implemented in disruptive classrooms, but right, these improving relationships work. There's an additional study by Baruti and others that looked at responsive classroom, found that the use of those practices from responsive classroom were significantly associated with relationships. And more specifically, morning meeting was found to be the most significant responsive classroom practice in terms of student-teacher relationship. Right. So there are 2 actionable steps that you can take as teachers, and they only require about 15 to 30 minutes a day, and they're best if applied with fidelity and consistency. All you got to do is implement these practices and be a reflective listener, right? Take in that information that your students are going to provide for you during these times. One thing you can do is a morning meeting. You can start with a little greeting, then you're going to give some students a chance to share every day, right, and respond to classroom questions. Then there's gonna be a whole group activity. It can be fast-paced, it can be academic or social. And they're gonna end by reading a morning message that you write out, and it can even be interactive, right? And gives you the news for the day, gets you ready for the day. Right, so these group activities can be things like Sparkle or BizBuzz or 3 Clues or Would You Rather, guided drawings, right? It can be academic or social, right? But everyone's involved. Your morning message is going to kind of welcome your students in every day. It could be a journal prompt, an APK from the previous day, or even a math challenge, right? You can switch it up every day, keep students engaged. Second thing you can do is have student-led community meetings, right? These are going to be student-ran, student-led, and your kids are going to decide, right? Make decisions in the classroom with everyone voting. You're going to give them autonomy and ownership over what happens in that classroom. You're going to provide some guidance in the beginning, but gradually release control, right? Because these are student-led community meetings. You can discuss things like class rules, make whole class decisions on class goals, right? Discuss things like bullying, lying, cheating, right? But give students autonomy there. You might say, I don't have time for this. You definitely have 15, 20 minutes a day to start off with morning meeting. You definitely have another 20 minutes once a week, right? This is important time to build that class culture, relationships, right? You might be saying my students won't engage in these activities, but if you keep doing them, implement with fidelity and consistency, you will see lasting effects, lasting positive effects in the classroom.
As you can see from our findings in the research we've provided, teachers can have a very influential role in the classroom. So instead of being strict, teachers should scrap that strictness and instead follow our 4 recommendations by beginning each day or period with a positive student-teacher interaction, getting to know your students personally, maintaining a high praise-to-reprimand ratio in the classroom, and maintaining relationships in the classroom with routine meetings focused on reflective listening. So to spend our time together in Q&A, we have a few questions to pose today. Number 1, how can we maintain the boundaries of professional teacher-student relationship while forming personal relationships with our students? Number 2, given that these recommendations have 0 cost barriers, why are they not universally practiced? If it doesn't cost any money and there's information about these recommendations, how come we're not seeing them in the classrooms? And number 3, how can we implement this approach to classroom management if administration emphasizes punitive discipline? Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed.